life, whether it's for a cause you care about. So I'm hoping that these will infuse you with ideas and some analogous inspiration as well. So I want to start today with a story about one of my favorite communities, maybe one that you recognize. This is a picture of the very first Little Free Library, and it was built in Hudson, Wisconsin, in 2009 by a man named Todd Bowl. It's in his front yard, and he built it with leftover wood scraps as an ode to his mother, who had just passed away and was an avid reader and a teacher. So you can see the library is pretty simple. It's like a small wood scrapped together, a little barn looking thing with a glass window, kind of like an old one-room schoolhouse. And Todd stocked it with books that he wanted to give away. And the premise was very simple. It was take a book, leave a book. And neighbors loved it. They started to ask Todd, hey, dude, can I get one of those for my yard? What is that thing? To fulfill these requests from neighbors, growing questions around these libraries, people wanting them in their own yards, Todd collaborated. As people in company, my team at People in Company would say, he built with other people. So that started out as collaborations with other builders, including a local man who had access to 100-year-old barns. He was part of the Amish community, and they had a bunch of old barns with extra wood. Also people who worked with recycled sawdust or had access to more chunks of wood all around the different neighborhoods and areas where he lived. So he got resources together to help build these libraries. He also collaborated with others to fund them. Or in the early days, building these libraries could cost between $375 and like $1,000. And Todd worked to create a pay it forward program, which helped reduce the price and also encourage neighbors to pool money together and share the cost of a library. Finally, and perhaps most crucially, Todd documented how to build one of these libraries yourself. So people far away from where he could drive to in Wisconsin could join in on the fun. And Little Free Library really set itself apart by establishing this design language that makes these little libraries instantly recognizable on the streets, even if they sort of aesthetically vary from places to place. So this year, in 2020, the 100,000th Little Free Library went up, and it's in Houston, Texas. So what that means in the United States, at least, is that there are 3 Little Free Libraries for every public library in the United States. And they're now in more than 108 countries. This is a photo from Sudan. And all of that started with one library and one man in his hometown in Wisconsin. But Little Free Library became a worldwide phenomenon only because Todd empowered other people. He found people who were raising their hands and made them co-owners of this movement. So for the last 4 years, I've been spending my time learning about people-powered, people-fueled groups and movements, and learning about stories like Little Free Library, all the way to how Twitch got started and diversified its community, to a squirrel census where people come together to count squirrels, to basketball teams, all sorts of different communities. And with my 2 business partners, we help coach people who are building communities and have written a book and have a podcast where we share inspiring stories. And I'm going to distill the 3 big takeaways that were really interesting to me, and something I didn't, things I didn't know until I went through all of this research, into kind of 3 takeaways for you. And I hope that you'll feel that they are true and find some way to incorporate them either into your work or your personal life. Before I jump into those sort of three takeaways, I always like to ground any conversations I do about communities in a clear definition. And I do this because I think the word community has been kind of becoming more and more ambiguous. And I think in some ways, rightly so. When we would interview people who were over the age of maybe 50 or 60 years old and ask them about their communities, they immediately thought about their towns or maybe their sports teams or their churches, something physically close to them. But I think that has really changed dramatically, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. Many people have communities that they connect to that are no longer physically near them. And especially in COVID, it's become only accelerated. And so I think in that shift, we're still sort of figuring out what is our collective understanding of what a community is to us and what it isn't. So I'll share with you our definition of a community. And it's not the most beautifully well-written one, or perhaps even the most insightful one, but I hope it communicates a few elements about what we see a community to be at People and Company. So the first one's pretty straightforward. A community is a group of people. The more specific, the better. So we tend to say that if you use the word community and instead of, say, an audience for maybe a social media account or a user base, like I think Mark Zuckerberg uses the word community to describe the entire Facebook user base. To us, that's not sufficiently specific. It's the people who are passionate, the people who are active. And the more specific you are in just kind of defining who those people are in your community, the more powerful you're going to be as someone who is designing things for them. So it's groups of people, more specific, the better. These groups of people keep coming together over something that they care about. And when we say keep coming together in tech language, that means they're retained. And you're not in a community if you only show up to be with these other people once. It's something you should come back to on a daily, weekly, monthly basis so that you can build relationships with people that are meaningful, learn more about each other, do more together. So groups of people can keep coming together, finally, over something they care about. And this is where some of the magic happens. Like, promoting literacy or neighborliness is perhaps part of the reason why little free libraries come together. The squirrel census may be very different. Twitch gamers may be very different. And part of that variation of whether we're coming together to play basketball, to promote literacy, to count squirrels, that leads to all the variation in types of communities. So some of the magic lies in really understanding what is it these people care about and making sure that what the community does together reflects that. So simple definition, communities are groups of people who keep coming together over something that they care about. All right, so now that's out of the way, bear with me. 3 takeaways. I will hopefully keep them entertaining for you. The first one is something we like to say in the podcast a lot. This is a big learning for me after talking to so many different people who started communities. And that's that as an organizer, as a community leader, you can't fake the funk. Most communities that we interviewed started from a very personal place. And I often tell people, you should ask yourself if you want to start a community, what's something that you care about enough that you would do it, that you would start this community or do this action, even if no one else joined you. And you should care about it that much because it will take that amount of commitment to build momentum and to attract other folks to get involved. So let's go back to Todd. Todd made this first library out of a very personal place. His mother passed away and he wanted to create a memorial for her. And he was going to do that, and he did do it, whether or not anyone else wanted a library, whether any of his neighbors raised his hands and said, hey, that's cool, I want to do that too, whether it spread to Sudan. He did it because he really believed in it. He really wanted to do it. What's a more maybe kind of businessy example or online example? I recently did a deep dive into the history of Atlas Obscura, which is one of my favorite websites. Whenever I travel, I use it. And they're a great resource that's a community-driven site, kind of like a wiki, of collections of oddities and strange, wondrous places in the world. So kind of like the hidden gem shop outside of Tucson, or the abandoned amusement park outside of Berlin, these sorts of otherwise undocumented but interesting places. And this site also came from a very personal place. The idea for Atlas Obscura came from a trip that one of the co-founders, pictured here, Joshua Foer, took when he was just 19 years old. He spent 2 months driving around the US, sleeping in the back of a minivan, also pictured here. And his goal was to have an adventure every day. He would try to find odd corners of the country and go visit them, go experience them. Like you can see on the top right, I think he's doing a hollering contest. And he realized in doing that it was hard to find these hidden places. If you wanted to uncover them, you needed other people to tell you about them. Otherwise, they would go undisclosed. So he, years later, solved this problem when he built Atlas Obscura with his co-founder, Dylan. And when he did that, the first about 150 locations, Joshua and Dylan wrote themselves from their archives, their research, their experiences. They populated the wiki. It was something they cared about. And so they kind of sparked the flame themselves. And then later they, when people visited the website and it got press, they had a clear call to action for people to participate and contribute their own wonders. But this also started from a very personal place, something that they were going to kickstart this passion project, whether or not other people jumped in. So something I'll ask you today is, what's something you would create? You'd create even if no one else joined you in that process. Do you care about this community that you're thinking about enough to host a first meetup or open a Slack group or whatever, when maybe there's only 3 to 5 people or just you in it, and stick with it until you build that momentum? I'll also leave you with one quote in this "You Can't Fake the Funk" section. For maybe, what if you don't have a remixable small library idea, or amount of insights for a giant participatory knowledge base like Atlas Obscura? How should you think about seeking out this thing you really care about? Well, this is Kat Velos. She has been on our podcast, and she started the Bay Area Black Designers community, and it's described as Silicon Valley's largest unofficial ERG for Black designers. She started it with 5 or 6 other local designers in her living room, and it now has more than 500 members. And the group provides professional development and emotional support and community for Black designers. And I want to share Kat's voice and her perspective so you can hear it on why she started this community. So here we go. If you can't hear the sound, someone please let me know.
For the first 10 years after college, I only ever met another Black female designer, like one. I got my degree in graphic design.
Wow.
And most of the jobs I've had, I've been the only Black woman in my team or department, and sometimes even on the whole staff. And I want you to imagine what that's like for you. Imagine if your whole working career, every job you've ever been, you were the only white woman there. And every conference you go to, you hardly ever see a white woman, and definitely not on stage. And when you go to events for your professional community, you hardly ever see another white woman. Wouldn't that start to feel strange to you? And it gets lonely. It gets really weird. Whenever I would find another Black designer, I wanted to put them in my pocket and be like, let's know each other.
So Kat talks about how she rarely saw other Black designers at conferences, at her work, in her city. And I want to share Kat's story with you because I think it's a great reminder that if you're ever feeling isolated, or if it seems like there aren't other people who look like you, who care about the same things as you, that those people are out there, and you can spark a community that draws them in. Of course, it takes action, it takes vulnerability, and collecting, maybe putting in your pocket like Kat did, those first few folks. But you can be the difference between someone feeling seen and supported and not. So, with Kat's story in mind, I want to leave you with a slightly different question, which is, do you see an elephant in the room? Is there something missing that you always feel like you notice or you sense that other people aren't seeing? Sometimes that's a great starting point for a community. Okay, so we talked about you can't fake the funk. Communities start from personal places. Many communities start from personal places. I just want to leave you with 2 more little insights, and then we'll all talk to each other. Get a little mingling going. So my second key learning is that great community leaders dial up the participation. They don't just talk at their members. You gathered them there because you have a shared passion point, and they're passionate about it, just like you are. So instead of sort of just speaking at people, you need to give them the opportunity to contribute and leave their fingerprints on the community. So we'll go back to Little Free Library. So Todd created many ways for people to participate in the movement that he unintentionally sparked. He, like I said, found a team of builders. He created ways for people to pool funds. And most crucially, he created a blueprint for people who wanted to build libraries themselves. And I think because of that decision, he didn't just create a certain library that was a business and you could buy one of these carbon copies from him, all of which looked the same. Instead, he gave people a template and allowed them to participate, collaborate, remix that template and make it their own. And that leads to all of this incredible self-expression that happens around these libraries. I'm sure you've seen some of them. And I think that this has really helped the movement spread even further because people are so proud of their libraries. They share them, people take pictures. But Todd really dialed up the participation by not just making one library for people, but allowing people to make their own and contribute. I want to show you one other community as a great example of how to dial up the participation. And I need to pull up a YouTube video for you. There we go, watch on YouTube. Can you all see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So what are other ways to dial up the participation, the community? You can take a traditionally one-way format that already exists, something that already exists, and invert it. And a community that's done a really great job of that is Choir in Toronto. So 10 years ago, these 2 guys walking out on stage, Nobu and David, hosted a 13-person choir at a surprise birthday party for a friend. A group of friends learned a song and performed it. Today, the choir that they built has become a community, meeting weekly to sing in one bar in Toronto and sometimes for big sing-alongs at iconic venues. So I want to show you one of them. I'll stop talking for a little bit. I really recommend watching their other videos as well. It's like even more emotional to watch now that we're not really getting together like that anymore. But the point I want to make with Choir is that they took a traditionally one-way format of a musician standing up on stage, singing at people, and they inverted it by giving people, there's low, mediums, and highs. They pass out a lyric sheet. Anyone can learn these parts and participate, and they do the work to practice together and create something beautiful. So there are many ways to take a one-way format and invert it. Maybe you take a lecture and you turn it into small group circles or salons. Maybe instead of just creating storytelling yourself, you collect a bunch of different stories around a theme and present them as a group, as an anthology. Instead of a conference where only some number of supposedly important people or somehow smarter people are up on stage talking, maybe you do an unconference where the attendees get to decide what they want to talk about and host the sessions themselves. Or, instead of a guidebook like Lonely Planet, maybe you make a wiki like Atlas Obscura. The point is when people can participate, when they can add their own perspectives, when they can talk about their own lives, when they can add their thumbprints on an activity that a community does together, you get less of what's on the left and more of what's on the right. Collisions, people learning about each other, bumping into one another. And that network is starting to be established where people can actually get to know one another instead of just the person at the center. So I'll leave you with dial up the participation. Figure out some way to make whatever activity you're doing with a group, whether online or off, something that invites participation for more people. Okay, final point. This is the great secret if you're trying to grow a community, which is that great community building, growing a community is not about management, it's about cultivating leaders. So the opposite approach to cultivating leaders is when one person or a couple of people who are leading a community become essentially a bottleneck. And that happened to an amazing community that we had on our podcast, started by this man, Gavin Preeter-Pinney. He's a designer who started something called the Cloud Appreciation Society, which is exactly what it sounds like. People who love to gaze at the clouds and feel like they're an underappreciated part of nature. And when we interviewed Gavin, he was at a sticking point because he had really controlled every part of the Cloud Appreciation Society. He designed all the pins, he sent all the welcome kits, he hosted all the excursions, he did all of the editorial. He hadn't really broken off pieces of ownership and allowed other people to lead their own local chapters or write some of the stories. He had kind of kept a bit of a stranglehold on it. And as he said, that's all very well and good up until a point, and then it just becomes a sticking point, a place where the society can't go any further than what his capacity is able to do. And that was the challenge that they were facing. So you might start a community by doing a lot for other people, opening the first Slack group, hosting the first event. But at every stage, think about how you can create big and small leadership roles for other people if you want the community to stay vibrant or possibly grow beyond your own capacity. And leadership roles like these can come in all different shapes and sizes. If you're at a run club, could mean someone becomes the pacer or the greeter. And maybe at an events space, online or offline, maybe you could ask someone to be an usher or the hype squad. Or maybe there's someone else who, becomes a host or an organizer of the event that you used to host yourself. But great leaders think about how they can break off pieces of leadership for others to take and making more leaders instead of just being the only one themselves. Okay, so we're just going to wrap up quickly by looking back at Todd Bull. So I started off by sharing how Todd started Little Free Libraries from a very personal place. He had just lost his mother and he wanted to create a memorial to her. And he did something for himself. It didn't matter if that was the only library that ever existed in the world. He was going to do it. Then he dialed up the participation. Oopsies. Creating a blueprint for people who wanted to build libraries themselves to be able to do so. Today, the organization calls the people who make and put up their own libraries all around the world and officially registers them. They call these people stewards. And my mom is one. Shout out Lane Dog. And many of these stewards, like we were saying, have gotten really creative, getting to put their own fingerprints, personality, local flavor on the libraries and the impact that they have in their communities. So some of these stewards have really gone above and beyond the call of duty. One of those is a woman named Malaz Kojali, who lives in Sudan. She's pictured on the far right here. And she launched a little free library network in an area of Sudan that lacked schools or libraries. And her personal mission is to bring 100 libraries to her country to promote literacy in Sudan. And Todd Bowl actually passed away 3 years ago when we were in the middle of writing our book. We were supposed to have him on our podcast, and he passed away between the time we had scheduled it and when we were supposed to have it. But the Little Free Library movement is thriving and resilient, even though he's no longer here, because they empowered other people like Malaz. So this year, 10 years after the first Little Free Library, 12 years after the first Little Free Library went up, the organization announced a Todd H. Ball Award for Outstanding Achievement. And Malaz, on the far right in Khartoum, Sudan, was one of the winners. And I would argue that the Little Free Library movement could have never gone beyond Todd's yard or his neighborhood or the state of Wisconsin or even beyond his own lifespan if he hadn't built it with others instead of for them. So that kind of leads us to the big takeaway, the big thing that if you forget everything that I've said today, I hope that this sticks with you. If you've read the book, it'll be familiar to you. But great community builders do this. They build a community with people, not for them. Building a community is about scaled collaborations, progressive acts of partnership with members of the community, doing more with others at every stage of the journey. So like I said, you might host the first event, create the product that people are attracted to, launch the Slack group. But from there, the more that each person in your community does, the more you'll all do together. And I would say the more it'll mean to everyone involved. So as we close, just a little reminder that it's funny to think back on now, but remember when we all could just have a casual happy hour, an ad hoc happy hour, or bump into someone on the street and have a serendipitous hangout that maybe leads to something more. This is what our life looks like now. We don't have those things. There's no more big all hands meetings or weekly Friday happy hours. And a lot of the people who I talked about today who sparked these communities, when we spoke to them in our research, they would say, I was just acting on instinct. You know, I didn't do this intentionally. There was no strategy, as they said to us. And what I want to say to you right now is that in our world today, that's not going to work. There is no unintentional community building in a pandemic. And I want to say to you, please don't sit back and wait for the community that you want in the world to magically appear. It's going to take intentional, proactive, committed work to get people together and empower them. And another way of saying that is one of my favorite phrases, which is that communities feel magical, but they don't come together by magic. So that was perhaps a longer presentation than I really promised Daniel. But that's some of the best learnings that I've had by talking to amazing people who are community leaders. And I'm sure some of you on this call would call yourself the same. And I know Rosie Sherry is absolutely one of those people who's on the call. But I want to open up to have more conversations with each of you and learn about what you're thinking about and working on. And I know Daniel too, you prepared some questions as well. But maybe we can jump in now to more of a discussion. That
Yeah.
sounds good.
So I've got a few questions from people who have sent me questions earlier before, as well as some people who have sent them to me right now. So I
Great.
guess what we can do is I'll ask a few questions and then I'll call everyone else who has DM'd me during your talk, and then we can kind of just open it up free for all as well.
Great.
So one of the questions, and this one's probably more mine and more casual, but is you've had the chance to talk to and interview many different groups, from the Cloud Appreciation Society to the dinner party to the Star Wars fan club. And I assume that during this time you got to participate in some of the activities. Were there any activity that really stood out to you, and why was that so special?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason I do this work is because I love enthusiastic people. Like people that have a burning passion that is separate. Honestly, like often it's the like money, fame, these like typical things that tend to motivate people like don't matter in these sort of like community spaces. And I think the event that I really wish that I had been at was the first Star Wars celebration, which was the first Star Wars fan club gathering that was organized by a lifelong fan, the head of the fan club for Star Wars. And George Lucas flew him into his ranch and asked him to put on this first celebration himself because he felt like it would be better if a fan did it instead of like Lucasfilm putting it on. And this guy got a museum in Denver that was like the aviation museum, the whole grounds for it. They flew in like all these different model airplanes and like Jabba the Hutt sculptures, and people from all around the world came in costume. I think we see these, like they still do these celebrations now, so I think people have seen pictures of them. But this first one was like 28,000 people in 2001, I think, or maybe it was a little bit later than that. And I feel like that is the one that I'm like, oh my God, I really wish I had been at that when I look back on it. But I think some of the stuff that we've participated in that's been really fun. One of them is a run club that's in the very first chapter of our book. It's in a part of New York City called Washington Heights, which is where a lot of like, it's kind of near the Bronx, and it's where like a lot of like rap music comes from, and very like sort of like rich cultural fingerprints in Washington Heights. There's a lot of like different music and types of food, and there's a run club started by a guy named Hector Espinal, and up until COVID, they had met for 2 or 3 years every Monday night at 7 p.m. and they had not missed one Monday. Like if there was a horrible snowstorm in New York, they were still going to meet on Monday and go for a run. And Heck started it. He was a big guy and he like had gained some weight, and he was like, you know what, I just need to run. I hate running. Like the only thing that will get me to run is if I run with other people. And so he's like the leader of this run club with another friend. And I have never been in a more like diverse group of people in my life. And I mean that in all ways, like from there were young teenagers, like people who were still in high school, to there was a woman who was in her 60s. Like clearly she was like a grandma, like she had a few generations like that she had yielded, you know, like different languages, every different skin color. And they just run right down the middle of the street. It like they like I went on one that was like 300 people. And when you show up, everyone's greeted. People say hi. They ask you who you are, if you've been coming. And I think that one really embodied a lot of the good side of communities. These types of communities that are benevolent and welcoming, and kind of give us a model for what groups of people can be if we are led well or organized well. And you know, not all communities are that benevolent or joyful or welcoming, but that one was really inspiring for me.
Interesting. And do you have any tips for, I guess, managing community and managing the burnout that you can get from, I guess, dealing with all the logistics as the community grows? And do you also have any like words of encouragement for when you're just starting out that community and it's just you and two other people looking at each other?
Yeah, those are both good emotional questions. The burnout one is real, and I think if anyone on the call has organized their own communities, they understand that. And I think that's the way it typically goes, is like you do your first one and you don't even realize you're burned out until you just like slam into a wall and you need like 2 years to recover from that experience. So I think like we're finally getting to this point, especially with like folks who are working online, of realizing you can be on 24/7 unless you create boundaries, first off, for yourself or within maybe some accountability group. And you have awareness that it's possible that I could be, really emotionally involved in this work. And that could lead to a lot of like emotional drain. So I think just the awareness of this reality is spreading. I think that's important. I think it's important to try to establish boundaries, especially when you're working online, just like it is for anyone with their work and trying to turn things on and off. But I would say this, kind of going back to this key principle that I mentioned of just trying to create other leaders. Like, are there parts of the work that you might be able to assign to other folks? So, for instance, I'm a part of a Slack channel called Hundreds Under 100. It's like a play on Forbes 30 Under 30. And it's all these like designers and creative people, mostly in New York. And one person started it named Carly Ayers. And as it started growing, she very quickly realized that she, as the person who is like deciding who enters into the Slack group or like validates people coming into the Slack group or decides on whether something was okay or not okay, was not only like she couldn't do it alone just capacity wise, but also like it wasn't going to be like effective work. She was like one white person, one white woman in Brooklyn. There's going to be a lot that she just was limited in her ability to understand or do. Like if she wanted to expand who wanted to be a part of the community, she couldn't be doing that all herself. Her community would be limited. Or if she wanted to evaluate certain situations as one person who has one world experience, it wasn't going to be the most fair or the most sort of like wide seeing. And so she's brought on people who do like the reviews of like who's been nominated to join the Slack group. And she has a group of folks who are admins who have like written the community guidelines and enforce them. And I think that thinking too about how you can create leadership roles and have other folks who maybe really care about some aspect of the community come in and help you with it is really great. And I think another community that I love, online community that I love that does this really well, is Bogleheads, which is like Jack C. Bogle's fans of his like investment strategy. It's like a finance nerd community that's really welcoming and has been on the internet for like 25 years. But they do elections. So like every year people are elected to be the like head of X or the head of Y. And that's sort of like an old school way to approach it. But I think if you set the tone of like, we're building this together, like it's not me doing everything for you. And like, what will you take off? Will you own this one piece? Kind of assigning structure, I think can help a little bit with the feeling that you're just maybe drowning or in charge of a lot of like really complicated situations.
Yeah, I think that builds on a bit to what you've kind of mentioned quite often in your podcast, which is community is a bit of a collective acts of partnerships. And collaboration is where you bring on partners and contributions from people again and again through regular activities and not once-off flagpole events. One of the questions that I have with that is to grow those little nodes of people and community, do you have to wait until there's a certain size to be able to implement that, or can you kind of try to get people engaged and empower them as leaders from the get-go?
Yeah, it's a great question. And my first instinct to say is like, I try to think about whenever I'm helping someone think through maybe a community shared activity. So the thing that they do together, perhaps it's these like AMAs that we're doing right now. But I always push people to think about how do they make a community member the star? So even for a little moment, how do you tell the story of someone who's in the community and hold space to talk about them or give them the opportunity to speak or share or present. And so I think as early as possible, creating places for people who are really passionate or are really dedicated to be recognized or to play a role in the community. I would say the sooner you can do that, the better. There's so many things that we sort of tune into passively these days, you know, especially just because everything's mediated by a screen, and it can really change the dynamic when, if I asked one of you to stand up on stage right now and talk, how you would feel about your experience of this session, right? While you're talking, you're creating it with us. And so I think it's not just like a smart move in terms of like, oh, I need some people to help me organize this community or create more communities. I think it's also just like a way to bring value, is to allow people to participate and show up. And so I kind of want to like now like start just, this is my signal that like I want to like start forcing people to talk a little bit. But I'm curious, like, does anyone here have an example of ways that they are maybe allowing leaders in a community to show up or contribute, or perhaps you are a member of a community and you're thinking about stepping into a small leadership role or supporting? Does anything come to mind for any of you? Now's the moment where I just, oh, Mohammed raising his hand. Great.
Mohammed, what's happening? Can you unmute or? Let's see.
Okay. Yeah, it was saying like the host has to unmute.
Oh, sorry. I think it's at the start. I had some settings.
No worries, no worries. Well, first of all, Bailey, thank you so much. Really educational, lots to take away from that. And the one example that comes to mind for me is that for forum communities, particularly for tech brands and stuff that I work on now, we basically reward participation at a certain level by giving people badges on their profiles that say like so-and-so expert. So rather than calling someone just an expert, there'll be someone that's like a hardware expert for CPUs, or someone who's an expert for, you know, casings or graphics cards or anything like that. And so we incentivize it on two levels. One of which is you get to be called an expert, and the other one is we stratified it so that, you know, there's pride that comes with like, oh, I'm a this expert and you're a that expert. And that's sort of the way the feedback we got was like, oh, that actually kind of legitimizes it even more because there's different types of experts. So that's the example that came to mind for me.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like it's, I've seen this too as well, like people who are on the Game of Thrones subreddit, there are badges for like different like houses that you affiliate with. And when we talk about kind of people being recognized for their contributions, what I'm hearing and what you're talking about is also just like blanket recognition is maybe not that valuable. And perhaps there are tools we have for like seeing someone's contribution in a more specific way and really acknowledging it. But I love that. And I totally agree. And I think that that's something that hopefully like design will continue to get pushed on in terms of just like the ways we allow people to signal their leadership or their contributions. But I think that's a great example. Anyone else with what they're thinking about with kind of creating new leaders on a platform, or your personal experience sort of becoming one? Anything come to mind?
We also have a question from Andrew, who I think could possibly fill in a bit on that as well.
All right, I'm unmuted.
Oh, here
Thank
we
you
are.
for having me.
Yeah.
Bailey, such a really fascinating conversation topic. So in my particular case, I was the first cohort of a program at MIT called the MIT Boot Camps. And out of that, I founded this community for the alumni called the Innovation Community, Support Community. And that eventually grew by leaps and bounds. And I hear you on the perspective of day and night nonstop. And, you know, on my own, I was like consumed by making this grow because it was a legacy that could last longer than myself. And so I guess, you know, having moved on from that, and also, you know, there's so many other people that we've empowered along the way. I guess my question is, you know, it takes an immense amount of time, it takes an immense amount of effort. Um, how do communities become sustainable? What insights can you share? Because, and again, I'm in a different role now in economic development, and continue to nurture and cultivate relationships here in the Midwest. And so it's the same question all over again, just different scenario. How do we create sustainable and viable communities where people can actually be, you know, paid to do this challenging work? Thank you.
Yeah. So just to make sure I understand, do you mean sustainable in terms of people are actually getting perhaps like paid or financed well? Yeah. Damn, that's a big question. Let me just say. And I think we're at this moment where there might be new technologies that could help us with this. And also converging with that possibility of new tools and technologies is, you know, a maturation of people who have had the experience that you've had, which is my grandfather was a union employee at United Airlines, and he was really active in it, but that meant like he flew to like a conference a couple times a year and got like a packet that he read once every like 3 months, you know? And when you think about how much, like how many hours it might take to actually like organize a community today, like just how many more inputs and outputs there are, there's a whole generation of people who've been through that, and I think know that it's real work. And I don't know that I have a silver bullet for exactly how this is going to get solved, but I think, and when I'm talking about the technology side, I think there are different people who are trying to solve that problem, whether it's through blockchain or through kind of actually building just like community tools where you can pay for subscriptions for different things. And I think there will hopefully be more innovation on the technology side. And then I think, you know, I would say what I think a lot of people have been saying in the care industry for a long time, which is that, at least in the United States, I think our culture tends to devalue work that is caring and serving others. And that's essentially what I think a great community leader does. You know, when you're organizing a group of people at MIT, you're serving them, you know, you're helping them connect to each other, find value, and find meaning. And I think that we have to probably have more people who appreciate how challenging that work is and how valuable it is, and kind of a culture shift for us to continue to drive like the creation of tools and also maybe the mindsets of members that this is valued. But I think it's happening, especially during COVID. I see so many more of like paid communities, and that used to be a thing when people were a part of, you know, the Masons Lodge or whatever, like it was something we did. So I think to sum up, I think we need probably more tools that don't just see this as free labor, but frame it up as something worth compensating and have the ability to facilitate that. And then I think too, hopefully there will be some culture shift that sees it as something that is worth money as well. But we'll see. It might be a challenge.
I think Jeremy, you have a question as well, don't you?
Yeah. Hey Bailey, very nice to meet you, and nice to meet all the rest of you. So my life goal is to create a world where everyone can follow their dreams. In doing that, we are basically building technology that helps houses run on renewable energy, grow their own food, and in small neighborhoods can pay their own mortgage. So last year we built a prototype house. So this is me, my contribution of like, I'm all in, whether I'm alone or not, but built a prototype house. And so now I'm working on building both an online community to share everything that we're doing and also a physical community of actual people living in these homes together. And so my question is basically like when we have, so like I have interest in someone joining the community or intrigue maybe, but how do I go from not onboarding on a digital community from intrigue into like connection, right? Because you don't stay on a community until you feel that personal connection and like, so how do you go from intrigue to connection?
Yeah. Well, I might throw it back at you. What have you tried so far? What are some of your hunches?
Yeah, I mean, I reach out and I just try and figure out how people are, what they're looking for, if they want to be involved, what their kind of dream is, and you know, I think it works for some and not everyone, and maybe those are just the wrong people, but yeah.
There's a lot to it. I think the different things that come to mind as I hear talking, and you're talking about an online space, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, first off, I also just want to acknowledge that what you're doing is epic and really bold. So I don't want to like steamroll past that. I'm like, dude, this guy's doing something really legit for the world. So congratulations and thank you. But I think a couple things stand out to me hearing you talk. Number one is, it sounds like what you're doing is like very values driven. And I would make sure that you put that out into the world so that people who connect with it show up to your doorstep. So like make sure you're putting the signal out that brings in the type of people that you think are the right folks to be in this community to help you drive this mission forward in whatever way you think having an online community is essential. But just, I think sometimes when we see things as businesses, we start to get really strategic about the way we talk about things, kind of for like a mass audience. And when I look at what you're doing, I'm like, I think you really need to be very clear about like what impact you're trying to have in order to bring the right early folks into your space. So like thinking about the signals you put out, maybe it's all already the case, but that just seems very important to me. And then from them, I think, just almost like product thinking, like if someone joins a space and they like don't know anyone, it's like walking into a party where you like literally don't know anyone, or there's like no conversations happening. Like someone's gonna like be like, I'm out of here. It's like I walk in and the room's completely silent. No one's talking to each other. Like, what do? I gotta leave, or I don't know anyone. I gotta leave. And I often kind of think about online spaces with some sort of mapping to like a real world experience. And I think like a forum I'd map to like a party maybe, or like a dinner party. And so I think that that's where like having someone make sure that like new folks have an activity, a way to like express themselves, participate, like contribute, and also maybe like a buddy system or like someone who's looking out for them and connecting with them is so important, because I think you only have like a limited amount of time to make someone feel like, oh, they should come back to this space and there's something there for them. So thinking about those early activities, actions, and kind of like how they're welcomed is so important. And just for like an analog example of that, we did some work with the Surfrider Foundation, which is like effectively the Sierra Club, but for water. So they're chapter-based organizations that make sure that like rich people don't buy the beach and like make it so no one else can go on the beach in California, or like clean the water in Malibu because it's polluted. It's like all these local activism groups. And if you show up to a Surfrider meeting historically, someone is like assigned to be your buddy. So like if a new person comes, they like find someone and they're like, hey, you're that person's buddy, like make sure they come back and make sure they have everything they need and all that. And so I just wonder how you and maybe some other people who are members of the community can think about structures and processes like that just make sure someone doesn't feel like they're standing at the party alone. Yeah, I don't know. Does that feel like it's helpful? Maybe other people have, and there's a lot of experts here. So if anybody else has any other ideas, please feel free to hop off the mic if you can.
No, I mean, I thought that was awesome. I'm just thinking about like, what's the activity that, going back to, it is very values driven and things like that. What's an easy thing to introduce yourself that showcases that other members would likely be drawn to, so you can kind of connect really naturally.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, and get creative. Sometimes weird shit's great, you know. Let people get a little out of their element right off the bat. Cool.
I'm conscious that there's about 10 minutes left. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to jump in. Someone else earlier had a question, but they are no longer here, so I'll just read it out for them. So Melinda before asked, how do you deal with members that are not committed? For example, they RSVP for events, but do not show up.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I would call those people members, yo. They got to keep showing up, you know? Yeah, I think, you know, the reality is online and offline, there are like concentric circles of commitment and intensity to any community. So I feel like there's probably this like central circle of people who are like, hell yeah, all in. I daydream in the shower about this. Like, this is all I ever dream of. Like, this is my favorite thing. Like, I played on a basketball team in New York. I was like in that concentric circle, you know, like this is the light of my life. And then outside of that concentric circle is probably some like regulars, you know, they're maybe not like hosting or leading, like they don't see themselves in like a leadership position, but like they're showing up consistently. They're like, I'm here every week, I'm here every month. And then beyond that, there's often like 90% of the people, depending on the way you're interacting, like somewhere between 50 and 90% probably of the people that are just like kind of passive, and they're not sure exactly like how into it they are. And I think your job as a community leader is to try to figure out ways to move people from one concentric circle to the next. So sort of like, what actions can I do to get someone who's passive to just like level up into like you're a regular? And also then the most potent thing you can do, I think, is to look at the regulars and give them leadership roles, because those folks can help you in exponential ways. When they become leaders, they can start like new initiatives, become the welcome brigade, whatever. But I think what I would say is, I don't know if I would call people who RSVP and don't show up members, but I would get really smart about those people and figure out maybe like an event is not the best way to get them into the community. Maybe you need to send a bunch of those people, 10 people every week, a personal email and just be like, yo, I see you RSVP a lot. I'd really love for you to come, like, you know, blah, 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 some kind of other like action or tactic to try to get them to become what I would call a member and more regular. But yeah, I think that there are often a big chunk of like more passive people. And I'm always trying to just be like, how many people can I knock into the bucket of like they're participating and they feel like active here?
Awesome, thank you. I think Ika also has a question next.
Hey guys, thanks again, Bailey, for your great speech. So my question is following, like, what do you think about the, like a niche? For example, in my case, I had a community about the math. And after that, I decided to increase the niche. For example, adding the different angels of science, like a science, like a chemistry, or all this physics or other stuff, and it's crashed because like people felt that it's not so much connected because there was kind of diversity in the community and all the other stuff. So what you can suggest how to increase, or what is the kind of any strategy for himself, any insights in this sites, like how to increase the community if you want to add more like a fields or something.
Yeah.
So.
I love it. You said you do so this is a math community?
Yeah, it was.
God, everybody here is so smart. I'm like, why am I on the microphone here? Anyway, yeah, well, I think first off, like in general, I think niche is really good. And the internet has like revealed the power of that. Like, I think when I was younger, everything was like really watered down and boring because the media we had was like billboards and TV. And like, I just keep being more and more amazed by like how specific people are about their passions and like how they want to connect in kind of like a pretty intentional vector sometimes. Like we were doing, I think Daniel mentioned we did some work for Nike with their run clubs. And they're like, I don't know, are people that into this or not? And I was like, people have like an Instant Pot community about like a crock pot. Like, I think we can pull this off, you know? Anyway, but just to say, like, I think niche is good. And from Meetup's data, I've also seen that they say like the more specific the meetup is, the more likely people are to turn into attendees. So like specificity is good. That said, I feel like what you're saying is you have like an umbrella of a community, and you created sort of all of these like kind of little constellations of more specific communities. And in that case, I feel like maybe I think there's a lot of strength in that model, but you're going to need to figure out rituals, activities that make the whole community feel like unified, these individual clusters. So I was talking about the Surfrider Foundation, for example, and they have chapters in cities and towns all around the world. So it's like, oh, this is the LA chapter, or this is like the Montauk chapter, or whatever. And they have a lot of sort of culture in the things that they do as a whole group. So you'd expect like the conferences that happen every year. But one thing that they do is they do a monthly win phone call. So anyone who has had what they call a coastal victory of making the water cleaner or opening up access to the water, that chapter calls in and gets to shout it out on the phone every month, and all the chapters can hear them. And it's a really good way to create, like, number one, like a sense that we're accomplishing something in all these little groups, and like a unity, a culture of action, they like to say. So I kind of think like maybe there's some layer of activities that is intended for all of your subgroups. And then perhaps the other thing is maybe people don't actually want to be interacting with people in their specialties. Maybe they want to bridge across and learn from each other. And if that's the reason why it's kind of off-putting to people, I would say maybe actually in your case, people want to be inspired by people in different fields. And that's what you want to start using as your organizing mechanism, is like actually making sure you're not putting people together who are like, oh, goddamn, I have to hear from that guy about this his thing again. Like, it's more of like meeting other folks. So I would say either like create some central unity if people are enjoying these subcategories, or if you feel like actually I need to mix people more, redesigning how that happens and these like atomic units of your community to be more about bridging people across specialties.
I think we're now at the 10 past mark, but if anyone has any final questions that they want to ask.
Yeah. So I'm a bit more about the point you were saying before, about, converting these people, the users who are not regular users, they're kind of casual users, into more regular users. Do you have any other like examples or tips about some good techniques to try to do that?
Yeah. Is Rosie still on this call? I think Rosie left.
I think she's left.
So what I love is Indie Hackers. It's a really awesome community. Probably know it. But I think Cortland has been so good, and Rosie as well, at making things participatory that you wouldn't expect. So one example from Indie Hackers that we share all the time is that the site started with Cortland interviewing like 150 independent entrepreneurs and publishing those stories for people to read. And very quickly, he like created basically a form for people to submit their own stories, and they would edit them and publish them. And I just like love that example, because I think there's a lot of things that maybe we assume like we can't just let other people do, when in fact you absolutely can. And so I think that that's a really great one of like having clear portals and entry ways and asks of people. The final thing I'll say too is sometimes the application stage, if there is an application stage, is a great place to understand like some way of moving someone from passivity into action. So I'm not sure exactly the nature of the community that you're talking about, but one of the communities that was on our podcast, The Dinner Party, is for people who all lost either a parent, a sibling, or a very close friend when they were too young. And they require like a very lengthy application. And they say people actually really like filling it out because it's a topic that they never get to talk about. And in all of those ingredients, they learn people's stories. They learn about like specificity of their like experience of losing someone. And they learn probably more about their skills and how they'd want to get involved. And so I think the learning there is like, how can you expose like more information about each member in that critical moment where they're signing up, excuse me, I'm coughing, so that you as an organizer can understand like who has what skills, who has what interests, that I might be able to like activate them into those things. So I think around sign up and getting into a space is the time when people have the most energy, like they've decided they want to be a part of this. So that time I think is very critical around either like learning enough about them that you can activate them later, or having a really great entry activity that sucks people
like
in.
What are we looking for specifically, you know, at this application? Is it more stuff that so we know what they will find useful and what they want, or is it so we know what they could give?
Yeah. Yeah, I think ideally it's the combination of both. So yeah, I mean, I think you want an opportunity to understand probably their identities and interests and skills, I would say. Like, why are they here? What do they care most about? And then what tools do they feel like they have in their toolkit? So I think those are good, but I also think maybe if you want to message me like on Twitter or email me so I can learn more about what community you're thinking of, I might be able to give better brain power towards it if I can understand that too. So feel free to send me a message.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. I guess we're now kind of up for time, so I don't want to take too much of your time anymore. Thanks so much for coming in today, Bailey. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm sure everyone has learned quite a lot.
Thanks for having me. And again, I appreciate your sunshine, post-it sunshine behind you. And thank you to all the smart people who attended and listened to me. I feel very flattered by how intelligent this group is. So it was a total pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
See you.